Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Ostroff.
Well, thanks very much. Geez, I really haven't had many opportunities where people play music before I climb up onto the podium. And thank you, Minnie, for those really kind introductions. I'll start my remarks by saying this is the perfect venue for me to speak, not only because I feel like I'm speaking to kind of my people, but also I don't have PowerPoint slides, so all of you can continue to very happily eat your lunch while I'm speaking. So I think it's also a pleasure to be here today with you as FDA's acting commissioner, and as was noticed, I've been in this position now for about 7 months, and to be part of this year's Regulatory Convergence. And I have to admit, I give kudos to whoever it was that came up with that particular name for this event, because as the conference materials mention, this is really meant to indicate that it's where all things regulatory come together. But from my point of view, it's probably more appropriate to say that it's where all people regulatory come together, because this, for me, is kind of like the Times Square of regulation. So, I did have an opportunity to take a look at the program, and there's an incredible diversity and range and thoroughness of all of the sessions in various participant categories, and I was kind of hard-pressed to think that there was anything that was missing. You have representatives here from industry, you have representatives from global regulatory bodies, from the research community, you have academic groups and clinical organizations, and these are all of the stakeholders that are necessary to align the science, the regulation, and the business strategies that are all important components of the regulatory process. So in short, I think that pretty much everybody is here, including those that continue to come in. And given the wide sweep of what goes on at a RAPS conference, maybe next year you should adopt the phase that this is the meeting that boldly goes where no regulator has ever gone before. And I'll also say that if any of you have ever heard me speak over the last several months, you likely know that I always invoke one of the great philosophers of all times. And no, it's not Aristotle, it's not Plato, and it's not Confucius, because if I mention quotes from them, I'd have to do it in either Greek or Chinese, and I barely can do a good job with English. But it's even better, it's the late, great Yogi Berra. And he's really an appropriate guy to quote in light of the fact that we're just down the street from wonderful Camden Yards and the World Series is about to start this evening. So Yogi is somebody that, for me, always seemed to be able to capture the essence of a situation. And even though when he made this particular quote, he wasn't talking about regulation, he easily could have been. And that is that he said, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. Some may say that the RAPS meeting is really the place where theory and practice come together. The members of this particular audience are here due to your commitment and your long-standing commitment to be the best that you can be as regulators, regardless of your specific role in the regulatory process or how long you've been involved in regulation. And for that, I really have to salute you. After all, on a nice fall day in Baltimore, what could be better than sitting inside this particular venue learning about medical product regulation? But in all seriousness, as somebody who spends all day revolved around developing and implementing regulations to promote and protect public health, I can really think of no better place to be. I don't think that I'd be sort of breaking any confidences or shocking anybody when I say that in some circles, if you say that you work on regulations, the response wouldn't necessarily be as positive as it is at this particular meeting. In some circles, neither the idea of regulation nor specifically the regulation of the products that are part of FDA's portfolio is very enthusiastically embraced. There are some perspectives that think that regulation slows down innovation or handicaps the medical products industry or are still far too prevalent. However, for some of these critics, for me, it just seems to be these negative arguments are cover. There are some folks that simply believe that regulation, any regulation at all, is too much regulation. I can't tell you how often that I've been in discussions where I hear that if we would just loosen up the regulatory handcuffs that stifle regulation, that so much can be done. And I've also heard that, any regulation is just fine as long as it's with anything other than my particular product line or my industry. So, many forget that there was a time before FDA was given the authority to regulate the safety and effectiveness of medical products, that our nation's history was filled with examples of tragic consequences for patients as a result of inadequate regulation. Drugs were marketed for thousands of unproven uses, often based on inadequate research, and in many cases were ineffective or even outright dangerous. Let's not forget that one of the most iconic regulators in FDA history, Frances Kelsey, passed away only a few months ago at the age of 102. Of course, her greatest achievement was to keep thalidomide off of the US market because of gnawing safety concerns that she had, despite the very vigorous protests of the manufacturer of the drug and the fact that the drug was already being marketed overseas. Today, however, I think the vast majority of Americans have really great confidence in the safety and effectiveness of their medical products. And throughout the world, we in the United States represent the pinnacle for regulatory oversight, regulatory vigilance, and regulatory infrastructure. We owe much of that success to those of you who are in the audience today. And I hope that we can all agree that whatever happens over the short and long term, we have to take care to never jeopardize or tarnish our gold standard reputation. So now let me change the subject a little bit. I know that all of you are certainly aware of the fact that there's never a dull moment at FDA. But this is really a particularly interesting time at my favorite regulatory agency. First, there was the departure of Peggy Hamburg as the Commissioner of FDA after 6 years at the helm. Peggy was, and I have to say still is, at least when I saw her last week, incredibly passionate about innovation, about the centrality of science in the regulatory process, and how FDA should be viewed as a public health agency that achieves its goal through regulations. She also was very passionate about the global nature of our work, something that's very much highlighted at this particular meeting. So guess what? So am I. I share Peggy's interest and passion in all of those areas. As you probably also know, last month Rob Califf was nominated to be the next FDA Commissioner, and he also shares these priorities. I can say that without hesitation. In addition, he is a consummate expert on the regulation of medical products, particularly as it relates to the evidence base for assessing product safety and effectiveness through clinical trials and other methods. The agency will be in very good hands under Rob's leadership. The second interesting thing that's currently going on are the congressional efforts to develop legislation to update the medical product approval process. As probably all of you know, a few months back, the 21st Century Cures Act was approved in the House with an overwhelming bipartisan number of votes. Work is also well underway in the Senate to draft the companion bill, which is referred to as Innovation for Healthier Americans. If that bill gets through the Senate process, efforts will then have to be made to reconcile the provisions in the bill from the House and in the bill from the Senate before the results can be submitted to the President and signed into law. Many parts of these bills will impact our and your regulatory activities, not only for pre- and post-market pharmaceutical development, but also in the medical device space. There's been a great deal of discussion that has ensued since 21st Century Cures was passed about how this legislation will affect the regulatory process, either good or bad. Regardless of which side of the debate that you're on, it will clearly integrate new tools into the regulatory process. And so it's really important for you to take a look at what's in that bill and how it may impact the way that the products that you are involved in and you regulate may be assessed differently. And to further complicate things, we've also just entered into negotiations for the next round of several of the user fee categories, including prescription drugs, generic drugs, biosimilars, and medical devices. The initial public meetings have been held for all of these programs, and the outcome of the negotiations has to be submitted to Congress for review and approval at a really very unique and unusual time, and that is mid-January of 2017. For those of you, and there are probably a few of you in the room who don't very closely follow politics, you may not realize that that is just before the next presidential inauguration, and it's just before the next Congress is seated. So the very unusual confluence of major regulatory legislation and user fee negotiations in the midst of an election cycle is quite unprecedented in FDA's history. So all I would say is stay tuned. We're in uncharted territory, definitely where no regulator has gone before. There's also another effort underway that I think that you need to be aware of that may not necessarily be quite as visible as some of the other efforts that I just mentioned, but it's probably equally, if not more important. And that is our multi-year process that's known as program alignment. The name itself may sound relatively innocuous, but in fact, it's one of the most substantial overhauls of FDA's field force as operated through our Office of Regulatory Affairs in quite a long time. Program alignment is meant to better ensure coordination of our regulatory activities between the field and headquarters than has been the case up to now. And it is a major step forward towards specialization of our field staff, our field offices, and our laboratories. So traditionally, our field personnel and their reporting chain operated as generalists. One day they could work on a food issue, the next on a medical device inspection, and in a simpler era and in the past times that may have been okay. But today, there's really so much innovation that's going on across all FDA-regulated product areas, and there are so many regulatory authorities that are coming down the pike that this traditional way of our field force doing their activities just will no longer work. It's really increasingly difficult and almost impossible for our inspectors to maintain proficiency across all of the various product areas. So instead, they will all become specialists, either in food regulation, medical product regulation, or import operations. And our district offices and our laboratories will focus only on one category of products, primarily designated by their geographic location and the types of industries that surround those locations. Some offices will focus only on drugs, some only on biologics, some only on devices, some on foods, and some on importation. So the overall planning for program alignment has now largely been completed, and we hope to be able to move into the implementation phase over the next 1 to 2 years. and I would certainly hope that you will notice the difference in a very positive way. We believe that this realignment effort will greatly improve efficiency within FDA, make better use of our field assets, and will bring better and more consistent oversight for our regulated industries. So one of the other reasons that I think this is a particularly interesting time at FDA has to do with regulatory science. This is a subject that's near and dear to my heart because, as was mentioned in the introduction, before I stepped into the acting commissioner role, I was the chief scientist at FDA. And I will say that without question that rigorous science lies at the heart of all of our work. Smart science-based regulation not only helps ensure the quality of what's being regulated, but also, when done right, creates a pathway for innovative products. My sense is that this is probably one of the few audiences that I don't have to describe what regulatory science is. I think that you know what it is. But without question, there wasn't a time that was not very long ago where our regulatory science enterprise at FDA was not particularly healthy. In 2007, our science board called us to task in a report that was entitled FDA Science and Mission at Risk, which found that we were increasingly unable to meet our scientific obligations. The report identified a number of reasons why this had occurred, including underfunding, a loss of scientific expertise, and new legislative mandates and responsibilities without the corresponding resources to actually be able to get them done. So I can say that this was a report that was really a wake-up call for FDA. And in response to that report, we strengthened the structure of our scientific enterprise. One of the things that we did was set up the Office of the Chief Scientist, which I was in. And we were charged with being better able to work both internally and externally to provide strategic leadership and advocacy for regulatory science for FDA scientists. We developed a strategic plan. We developed priorities for regulatory science that focused on creating initiatives designed to improve knowledge, methods, and tools essential for successful development of medical products. We also strengthened our infrastructure, as any of you who have been to our White Oak campus would know. These resources have allowed us to increase scientific collaboration and various partnerships, as well as being able to recruit additional scientists to FDA staff. So from my perspective, this is kind of a new business model for FDA, and wherever possible, we are attempting to put in place initiatives that both promote smart regulation and innovative product development through partnerships and collaboration. These efforts seem to have paid off. In late 2013, we asked our science board to take a fresh look at the health of our regulatory science enterprise, and they did so, and just last month issued their new report, which is entitled Mission Possible: How FDA Can Move at the Speed of Science. I would urge you to take a look at this report. It is on our website, and it's a mere 38 pages long, which in comparison to many of the applications that come to the agency is really just the blink of an eye. I'd especially ask you to focus on one statement that was made in this report, which is that the responsiveness of FDA to the Mission at Risk report and those responsible for overseeing its work has been extensive, transformative, and laudable. Many substantive changes have been made in FDA's organization, authorities, and programs that significantly address the issues that were identified in 2007. But I'd also urge you to take a look at that report because it makes a series of recommendations to FDA about priorities for the agency in the area of regulatory science, especially those recommendations that deal with medical product development, medical product quality, and medical product safety. It will give you a sense of our priorities and the future directions that we plan to go in our scientific program and where our resources will be invested. We've also created what I think are smarter and more effective approaches to regulation from the regulatory flexibility that we've brought to the approval process, including our 4 expedited review programs, patient-focused drug development, new clinical trial designs, and increased collaboration among stakeholders. And in the remaining time that I have, I'd like to focus on a couple of these topics. So as you likely know, on the medical product front, we approved 41 new drugs and 10 biologics in 2014. This is a banner year by any standard that was fueled, at least in great part, by regulatory flexibility. These approvals included major therapeutic advances in oncology treatment, in hepatitis C and diabetes, and more drugs for rare diseases than at any time in the agency's history. It's not just the number of those approvals, it's also the speed of the approvals that occurred in 2014. We are now generally faster than our international regulatory counterparts in Europe and Japan, and this often brings first-class products to Americans first. We've also worked to incorporate the voice of the patient along the entire medical product continuum, from development to review to approval. We have learned that the input of a patient within the drug development process can make a real difference, transforming patients from just being a statistic to being names and faces. There is nobody that has a greater stake in the medical product review process than somebody who has the disease in question, and only they are in the unique position to be able to provide essential insights about product needs and desired outcomes. One of the major efforts that we've put in place to strengthen the patient's voice is the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative. This 5-year effort is part of FDA's performance commitments within PDUFA 5, and it includes holding at least 20 public meetings in different disease areas. 17 of these meetings have already been conducted, and the remainder of them are scheduled. The focus of these meetings is meant to engage patients and caregivers in a facilitated dialogue with FDA. And the goal is to be able to elicit individual experiences and perspectives on the symptoms of their conditions that are of most significance to them, the impact of the condition on their daily life, and on various approaches to being able to treat their conditions. The contents of these dialogues is relevant beyond the drug context, and FDA staff from medical device and biologic centers routinely participate in these meetings as well. Meanwhile, our Center for Devices in Radiologic Health has launched the Patient Preference Initiative in order to be able to develop a systematic way of eliciting, measuring, and incorporating patient preference where appropriate through the total product life cycle to drive more patient-focused and patient-centric device development, evaluation, and delivery. As probably all of you know, meaningful patient engagement is not without its challenges. Patients have to be able to understand the regulatory framework. They have to be able to understand clinical trial design. There are operational challenges, and there are legal and practical limitations facing medical product developers. Patients need to understand all of these things. In addition to that, we know that patients don't all necessarily speak with one voice, and there can be very diverse perspectives about the outcomes that they would like to see take place. Last month, FDA announced our first ever Patient Engagement Advisory Committee, which will provide advice on these complex issues related to medical devices, the regulations of these devices, and their use by patients. This advisory committee is a first for us, and it really is a new and exciting opportunity to foster patient partnerships with FDA. And it complements the other efforts that are going on within the agency to bring the patient into the medical device regulatory process. The advisory committee is designed to advance the science of patient input, spur patient-centric medical product information, and inform patient-centered regulation. So let me give you a couple of other areas where our understanding of science is really playing a transformative role, and that is in the area of genomic science. It's only been 12 years since the human genome was mapped and a complete genomic sequence was developed. However, today, genomic sequencing is being applied to almost everything from viruses to humans. We may soon be at the point where it's probably passé even to use the term next generation sequencing, since it's really very quickly becoming this generation sequencing. Just consider the impact that genetic factors are now playing in drug response evaluation in drug development. In recent years, approximately 1/3 of the new molecular entities that have been approved by FDA have included genomic analysis in their marketing applications. Sometimes these were only for exploratory purposes to be able to understand variability in drug metabolism, but in many cases they were included to support patient selection or to support the drug dosing. In fact, targeted therapies have now grown from approximately 5% of approvals in the late 1990s to more than 25% of approvals over the last 2 years. The FDA has been working to be able to put in place the scientific skills, the personnel and fiscal resources to be able to address genomic sequencing, not simply in drug evaluation, but also across the entire spectrum of FDA responsibilities and regulated process. In CBER, for example, scientists are using deep gene sequencing as a method to be able to monitor the consistency of live virus vaccines. CBER has been evaluating this technique for the feasibility to be able to provide detailed information about mutations that may arise as the vaccine strains are being grown. Work on next-generation sequencing diagnostic technology is also being pursued in CDRH to lay the groundwork for how we optimize our oversight of genomic diagnostic tests. We had a public meeting about this particular topic in February, and there will be another public meeting held in November. Achieving high-quality next-generation sequencing for diagnostics is also the agency's major task under the President's Precision Medicine Initiative that is being carried out in concert with our partners at the National Institutes of Health. Next-generation sequencing also really plays a very important role on the F side of FDA, that being the food side, and we are now increasingly using this methodology in our foodborne illness investigations, and it has literally transformed our work and has become an essential investigative and regulatory tool, allowing us to be able to perform more sophisticated pathogen identification and to be able to better pinpoint the source of foodborne outbreaks. Each of these efforts is an example of sound regulatory science, including in the involvement of transformative medical technologies being turned into useful and innovative medical products. Let me just mention one other area that we are trying to drive innovation, one that's quite important to this audience, and that's the area of combination products. It's an area of great discussion in regulatory affairs because it represents a growing category of therapeutic and diagnostic products that pose very unique challenges because of their complexity and because the review often involves the input and expertise of multiple components at FDA. Not surprisingly, effective coordination amongst FDA staff, as well as between the agency and the developer of a combination product is absolutely essential. We have FDA's Office of Combination Products within the Office of Special Medical Programs to oversee and coordinate this type of regulation. They work very closely with our medical product centers to develop processes and policies and to coordinate and resolve differences of opinion between the centers or with the sponsors. FDA recently completed an internal review of our oversight of combination products and recently published the results of this internal review. We are also working to develop new models in this recently published report for better coordination and predictability of the combination products pathway. It's also a topic of great legislative interest. But to be very clear, no matter how well we are doing, our work is far from done. As Thomas Edison once said, restlessness is discontent, and discontent is the first necessity of progress. Show me a thoroughly satisfied man, and I will show you a failure. We at FDA are certainly a restless group, and we are a restless group to achieve success. Having said that, sometimes even the most innovative regulatory standards in the world won't lead to new treatments or intervention when what's missing is the fundamental understanding or lack of understanding of the essential biology of a particular disease. There are many examples of these circumstances, Alzheimer's being one that readily comes to mind. And to be able to overcome the lack of this fundamental science requires really quite a different roadmap. So let me touch upon one other area of great interest, and that is biomarkers. This is an area of increased interest and investment. The ability to be able to stimulate biomedical innovation, including accelerated the development of biomarkers and surrogate endpoints, is really vital to assist in evaluating new therapies. FDA already accepts the use of hundreds of biomarkers and surrogates for a whole variety of purposes through drug development, including blood pressure changes, blood sugar reduction, tumor shrinkage. The list is quite long. But many of the use of these applications is not publicly available. So we've had a renewed focus on biomarker evaluation and qualification. There's currently a meeting on biomarkers going on at FDA as we speak, but without scientific understanding about the causes and biochemical pathways of many diseases, biomarkers and surrogate endpoints frequently fail at great cost to industry. Moreover, solutions that focus on requiring FDA to review poorly substantiated biomarkers will only slow drug approvals. They will not speed them up by forcing us to divert medical reviewers from drug applications to biomarker evaluation. To fill this knowledge gap will require a much greater public and private investment in biomedical research, as has been called for in 21st century cures. The medical research community must continue to expand its understanding of underlying disease process, natural history, and where the best targets are for potential therapeutic development. But where some see obstacles, some also see opportunities. And one way we're seizing this opportunity is to be able to strengthen collaborative efforts across government and with academia, industry, and patient organizations. I hope that many of you seated in this audience today will help us play a role in building and strengthening these types of partnerships. So I'll close today by returning to where I began, which is the important role that FDA plays in protecting Americans by regulating the safety and effectiveness of the products that they use. At a time where there is a yearning to realize the enormous opportunities afforded by scientific developments, we have to also preserve FDA's historic role as the protector of the American public. This is in the interest of FDA, it's in the best interest of regulated industry, and most importantly, it's in the best interest of patients and consumers who use FDA regulated products. Change is necessary, but it must be done carefully and with due diligence. In addition, changes in regulatory approaches must ensure that there are adequate financial and personnel resources provided to be able to assure that any new responsibilities are additive rather than detract from the already limited resources that are available at FDA to do some of the things that we've been doing increasingly well. While there are sometimes tensions between the speed in which products can move through the marketplace and the amount of time necessary for their adequate study, we must not shortchange the standards that have provided Americans and patients around the world with medical products that are both safe and effective. After all, innovative products are only innovative if they've worked. You've probably all heard that before. In the end, that is where regulatory convergence must take us. As you all understand, regulation can be complex, but the underlying rationale for it can often be quite simple. As Albert Einstein once said, everything must be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And that may be the most concise thing that anybody can say about regulation. So I will simply close by saying thank you, both for the opportunity to be here today with you and for the work that you do for the American public. It's great to be here with you. Thanks very much.